My background, I was trained as a historian, but by the time I had finished my education, there was no need for any history teachers in Sweden because all the baby boom generation had already been there. They had taken all the places in history. I was obliged to find something else to do, so I went into foreign affairs instead. I was in Hanoi immediately after the war, and then I was in Geneva as a negotiator because the Swedish Foreign Service is so tiny. So we do the extremes. We never learn anything at depth. We do all the small things, and we call it becoming a generalist. And that sounds very impressive. But I wanted to have children. And we had introduced paternal leave. But the foreign policy establishment is always rather conservative in all countries. So at the end of the 70s, diplomats at paternal leave wasn't very welcome. So I transferred to a think tank at the Ministry of Finance, because there it was quite easy to be on maternal leave. You wrote a draft of a report, you sent out the draft for comments, and then you could disappear for a couple of months, and nobody took notice that you were gone. And by the time I came back, I had all the comments and could continue my work after having been with the child for a couple of months. So I became a Minister of Finance man. And I then was transferred first to the Swedish Association of Local Authorities. And then after a couple of years, I went on to one of the trade union centrals as head of research and policy. But I always stayed a historian. And I think I want to emphasize that first of all, because I was invited to a conference for all the young researchers in history in Sweden. They wanted some historians who had done something very different to talk about their experience. And I thought it through, and I told them that I've never got a job because I was a historian, but in all the places I've worked, I have always had great use of history. Because if you are at a place, if you have some kind of responsibility, if you're interested in some matter, the most productive question you could ask is, why does it look like this? How did this come about? And if you then go back to the great challenges in 1987 or 1956 or 1882, and you think through the alternatives and you analyze how did they go about, how did they weigh different problems against one another, you get something of a distance to the solution that they ultimately choose. And you can start thinking, perhaps we could go about this in a different way. And sometimes you even pick up ideas that were rejected 30 or 50 or 80 years ago. But by now, they have become technically feasible because we have had the technological evolution which makes it possible to do things in a way that our parents or grandparents couldn't really imagine. So when Nina contacted me and invited me to this seminar, she also sent me the program. And when I looked at the program, I saw that you will come back time and again to 1917. You will compare what happened in February with what happened in October, and you will also go through and look at what were the conditions. So I thought that I might hitch onto the 1917 theme and try to describe what was the Swedish 1917. How did we get there, and how did we go from there? Now, the point is that there is a similarity between Russia 1917 and Sweden 1917. There is even a connection, because on his way home from Switzerland, Lenin stayed in Stockholm and bought a new suit. That's what you do in Stockholm if you're here. Before he continued with the train to St. Petersburg. But that was not the only similarity. We were affected by the same kind of economic crisis. It wasn't as deep as in the war-stricken countries, but we had a problem with inflation because the Swedish upper classes exported much of the surplus to the war countries. We exported much of food from Sweden, so we suffered from a penury of food, and 1917 was a disastrous year for potatoes. And although we are not as dependent on potatoes as the Irish, we are not very far behind. So the sufferings were tremendous. And we had a radical political stream in the labor movement, and there were demand for a radical change of government, and we had an almost revolutionary ambiance in Stockholm and in several of the small towns, and it was explosive. The king packed his baggage to leave the country and go to Germany. I mean, it was at that point that people really thought this might turn into something really nasty, and we could also have a revolution. And some of the leading social democrats went to Petrograd in spring 17 and came back from Petrograd and were enthused by what they had seen after February, March, and said that perhaps we should do something the like here in Sweden. But it took a radically different way. Perhaps in part thanks to you. It didn't erupt in 1917. It simmered and lingered on, and it was put to a more decisive point in 1918. And what happened was that we managed to convert it into a parliamentary drama. It was backed up by huge demonstrations in the streets, but it took place in Parliament. And I think that the right-wing politicians who controlled the upper chamber of the Parliament, and the upper chamber could block all legislation, so it was really a fight about who would control the upper chamber in the future. That fight was won because the right-wing parties yielded to the left-wing parties and gave up control without a fight, because I think they were so scared by what was going on in Russia. So Russia helped us bring about democracy in Sweden. It had sufficient impact to convince the leading right-wing politicians that they should accept democracy. Accepting democracy was in a very technical, prosaic, perhaps Swedish way, because the issue was really voting rights in municipal elections, because the municipalities were the ones who elected the upper chamber. And what gave the right wing their power was that we had had local self-government from the 16th century onwards. From the beginning, we tried to reach consensus. But in the 18th century, we started to vote in municipal elections. And the ones who voted in municipal elections were not the individuals in the municipality, but the farms. And the farms were of different sizes. So you were allotted a number of votes according to how large your farm was. And we took that into the modernized municipal elections that came about in the 19th century. We had a scale of votes which accorded 40 votes to the richest inhabitants and 1 vote to those who had the least votes, and a number of people didn't have any vote at all. But that 40-graded scale assured the upper classes of a right-wing majority in the upper house of parliament. So when we abolished that and introduced a universal and equal vote in municipalities, which we already had at the country level for the second chamber, when we made that transformation, we also democratized the whole parliament and made it possible for the labor movement to hope for a parliamentary majority. They didn't get the parliamentary majority at once, but in the 30s, they became the leading party of government, and off and on, they have retained that position ever since. That's one aspect when you compare Russia and Sweden. Another important aspect, when I was invited by Jura and Lena, they wanted me to talk about Swedish socialism, but because in the late 90s, that was an issue in the Russian debate. And people said that we want socialism, but we perhaps shouldn't have Soviet socialism, but why not a socialist Sweden style? And Lena wanted me to explain what is socialism Swedish style. Now, the answer is very simple. It's a highly competitive capitalism. That's what Swedish socialism is. And that also has to do with the labor movement. As Lena said, in the 19th century, Sweden was a poor country on the outskirts of Europe. Our blessing was a high literacy rate, which meant that we had a population that could easily go from working in agriculture to join the nascent industries in the town. We also had some rather foresighted bankers who dominated Swedish financial life and who ensure that we had financial autonomy. The rest of Europe was dominated by German and French and English bankers. So many other countries in Europe never developed the kind of independent economy. But Sweden, thanks to our rather modern bankers in the 19th century, we could finance some highly competitive industries. You know, Ericsson, Alfa Laval, Saab, Volvo, Scania, they all came from this environment of competitive capitalism, of foresighted bankers. But one of the preconditions for this was that Sweden was a free trade country. We welcomed influences from abroad, and we also made use of export opportunities as they develop. Sweden was also a pragmatic, or you might say opportunistic country. We stuck to neutrality. And when all the rest of Europe was at war with one another, we sold to both parties. So we made huge profits during the wars because we could take market shares from the fighting countries. We established a rather huge presence in Tsarist Russia because you were at war with Germany. And when the German enterprises left Russia before the war and during the war, Swedish enterprises took their place. Ericsson was there, Nobel was there, and many other, Atlas Diesel was there, and many other Swedish firms. But the problem is, if you want to be a successful capitalist in a small country, you can't offend the people that you are working with. And we had a very strong trade union movement. The trade union moves in Sweden organized a majority of the workers in the working places at a very early stage. And they went on to form the Social Democratic Party. So we had a strong centralized trade union movement, and we had a Social Democratic Party which gained more and more strength and also gained the parliamentary opportunity when the right-wing parties backed down in 1918. And the interesting thing is that from an early stage, the unions collaborated with their employers. We had strikes during the first part of our industrial evolution. But gradually, we entered a stage where we had rules and procedures for negotiations between the trade unions and the employers, because they realize that peace in the workplace, undisturbed production, was a prerequisite for success in production and in exports. So the trade union movement in Sweden understood that they were helped by export success for the firms that employed them, because the benefits from exports were taxed by the social democratic government and transferred to develop a welfare society. Now, the concept of the welfare society is another important point. When I was at one of the seminars with the school, I was there with Lord Skidelsky, who wrote famous biographies on John Maynard Keynes. But Skidelsky and I followed the Russian news because there was a strike at a tractor factory somewhere in Russia that had had 30,000 employees. And when that tractor factory was closed down, the employees went out and they blocked the railway between Moscow and Petersburg to give emphasis of their requirements. And that was, to me, very interesting, because in a way, the revolution in 1917 had frozen the development of welfare in Russia. You were stuck in the pre-revolutionary system of providing social welfare, where the factory, the workplace, the firm you were employed by, they provided you with the social safety net that you needed. So you had to remain at that firm to have that safety net. It was dangerous to leave the job at that firm and go somewhere else. The development that we had in the 1930s onwards was that we developed a social safety net that was independent of the workplace. We made it a nationwide assignment to provide social insurance, health care, child care, care for the elderly, schools. This should be provided by the state or by the municipalities, because that made the workforce independent of their employers. They could go from one job to another. We had the crisis in the 1970s when our shipyards were wiped out in only a matter of years. But whereas they had large social unrest in France, where they had a similar development in the 1970s, the people who were employed at the shipyards in Sweden, they were not very happy with becoming unemployed, but they knew that they would probably be unemployed only for a couple of months. During those couple of months, they would receive unemployment insurance from the state-sponsored institution that provided unemployment insurance. They would be retrained by vocational training schemes that were set up by the unemployment authorities of the state, and then they would find a new job at Volvo, which was what most of them did. And they would have their social security unimpeded, because it was not the shipyards that ensured their social security, but the state. And that is a very important lesson, because in a modern society, jobs come and go. I mean, that's the fruit of technological development. And when I was responsible for the medium-term surveys of the Swedish economy, we made a study to see how many jobs were destroyed each year in the Swedish private sector? And the answer is something like 20-25% of all jobs disappear in a single year. But they are replaced by other jobs. So what we need is a mobility in the workforce. And that mobility is something that individual employers are not interested in. So if you want institutions and mechanisms that ensure mobility and transferability and makes you sure that you will have the people you need in the new developing branches of the economy, then the state needs to take the responsibility. And that was what happened in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and that was the political branch of the Swedish labor movement, namely the Social Democratic Party, which dominated government in those years, that took that responsibility. This is not to say that we don't have any problems. We had the 70s and 80s when our model was very much in difficult straits. I mean, we had a rather high tax rate going up to 55-60%, which is large. We had problems with absenteeism in the workplaces. We were worried that many of our large enterprises were technologically outdated. We thought they were going down. We couldn't see anything that could replace them. But in a way, I think Lena pointed at what is part of the explanation, namely that when you have a high level of education, people can adapt, sometimes much more efficiently than politicians think, or journalists, or social scientists like myself. People are much more clever than you sometimes imagine that they really are. And what happened was that we went through a terrible crisis in the early 1990s, where our central bank became famous because they imposed an overnight lending rate of 500%, and that was unheard of in civilized Western societies. But thanks to that traumatic experience, we had to reconsider many of the institutions in our labor market. So we went through a renovation of the model that made it easier for us to grapple with what was coming on. And then we were favored by something else. We are very lax when we bring up our children. I mean, upbringing of children in Sweden, we allow them all sorts of things that my diplomat colleagues from other countries in Geneva, they were shocked when they saw what we accepted from our children. And one of the points in the early 80s, as this was the introduction of the personal computer. And my colleagues also bought the Apple computer when it appeared, but they locked them in and said that only the adults in the family are allowed to touch the PC. Whereas when Swedes bought their personal computers. Well, we don't lock any doors in our homes, so the kids were there hammering away on our computers. And that was something that kept them busy, so we could do other things while they were toying with the computers. But 20 years later, we had the most innovative electronic industry in the world with, I mean, Skype, Spotify, you name it. Many of those things came from Sweden, if they didn't come from Finland, which had a similar experience at about the same time. So sometimes you have cultural oddities in your societies, but if you are liberal enough, they can be a blessing in disguise. You didn't really think of them, but they can help you. And we were helped a lot by our children, and we are very grateful to them. And now I've spent the 45 minutes I was allotted. Thank you.